Thank you so much for that. It was really nice to hear you take us through these particularly important moments in the history of literary studies. And I'm wondering if you had a comment or a reflection on the contemporary moment, where we might think of the literary in a more expanded sense, with both expanded in terms of linguistic diversity, with the rising literatures from many indigenous communities throughout the continent, and also in the sense of the manifestation of the literary. I'm thinking of digital forms and the other ways in which the literary has expanded. And I'm just wondering, do you think that these very important reflections and ideas speak to the contemporary moment in the same way, or are they no longer adequate to help us to understand that? I'm just interested in your view on it.
Well, I think we're normally not very much receptive to different forms of manifestation of literary text. What do I mean by this? There is a discussion about normally a discussion that involves value. We discuss, after all, what is it that we consider literature if we think of a specific kind of text that has some specific qualities. That's the first question. The second question is how it is presented, what its physical manifestations. And this relates either to the discussion that we were talking about before, for instance, the Native Amerindian, the Native American population that uses the word oralitura because there's an issue concerning the fact that literature comes from litere, letters, and is related to the written world, but the tradition for the Amerindian population is an oral tradition, basically. And how do they keep up with both sides? Because, of course, they also publish books, meaning they are also connected with this written word. And this is one aspect. The other aspect is the aspect that you have here brought to us, which is what do we do with the digital world? Well, my point of view is that what we should focus on is not exactly on the means to present the text, but the texts themselves. I think it's a positive thing that today we don't have to have the physical. Although I'm a real fan of paper. Really, my age, I could say that I was brought up reading text in paper. But the question is, I think there are many games, if we can use this word here, in circulating text digitally, especially for the people who can read those texts all over the world, and it would be far more difficult for them to read these texts if they had to circulate only in paper. As we know, it's difficult, even if when we talk about a national ambience, if we talk about an international ambience, it's even more complicated. So I think we shouldn't have a difference in terms of considering more valuable or less valuable a text because it is published in paper or if it circulates digitally, because what matters is the text in itself. And of course, the ways of circulating are different, but I don't think a difference, if we consider the word value, should be made because the different ways of circulating the text. And have I answered? I don't remember about the many languages. Of course, these are real problems because today, if we talk about the digital world, for instance, the digital world is a world in English, basically. And we can say that today there is a situation in which this language, English, is the most used in the planet. But this doesn't mean that we should accept the idea of international monolingualism for many reasons. The first reason is that when we speak of English, for instance, and I'm speaking about exactly the same language, well, it doesn't make any difference. We know that we are not speaking of the same language, so as to say, if we are in Ireland, or if we are in Nigeria, or if we are in the US, or if we are in New Zealand or India, although in all those places people have as their official language English, but can we really say it's the same language? Maybe that famous sentence that I saw attributed to Bernard Shaw, but also to Oscar Wilde, and related to this idea of difference between the same language. The phrase was that the United States and England are two countries separated by the same language. And maybe we could say the same about Portugal and Brazil, or Portugal and Angola, and all those things. But I think that linguistic diversity is something very important for the planet, for the people themselves, for the expression of the different ways of living, of thinking, different ways of life of the human population. And so, of course, this should not be discarded for a supposed monolinguism. That's it. Thank you.
I was just thinking about what you mentioned about reception and the importance of reception.
Reception.
I was wondering that I try to accept that circulation and cultural circulation is as important as cultural creativity, but at the same time, I'm trying to think that normally those avant-garde texts are not bounded to a unique national context, nor are they unilingual, but in many cases they were multilingual and transnational. So in that sense, we won't be talking about literary productions from point A being consumed in point B, but about literary productions being produced in transit, while in transit about different scenarios. And I can mention here very different examples. The first one could be someone like C.L. James from Trinidad, studying Shakespeare in Trinidad and applying left politics, what he learned about left politics in the UK, in Ghana, but then also dealing with the Haitian Revolution and engaging with many different initiatives in many different languages as well. So my question goes in sense that Nulas, and ask what would happen if we consider this avant-garde tradition as a plurilingual and, let's say, transnational reality instead of something located within the framework of specific nation states. Because someone such as Enrique Fulvenia was using the idea of Hispanidad, for example, I think in a strategic way. So as you mentioned, it wasn't just dealing with Spain, it was also dealing with how to best use different cultural traditions in order to make sense of his contemporaneous within the Dominican Republic. So how could we learn from that avant-garde if we consider it as a transnational plurilingual reality?
Well, I think it is, in this case, it is a transnational plurilingual tradition, although the word tradition was abominated by all of them. Yeah. They would abominate the very use of it. But my point is that even when we talk about the specific proposal, for instance, futurism, 1909. So Marinetti has a specific manifesto in 1909, and of course this manifesto circulated widely. And it's interesting that he went to South America, and he went to Brazil and Argentina, and in the beginning of Brazilian modernism, the first writers were called futurists, so as to say. But Mário de Andrade, he said, and he wrote this, that he was not, eu não sou futurista de Marinetti. I'm not a futurist like Marinetti. Meaning that, in a way, what did he do? Okay, I see what you have done, but you see, this and this are good for me, and this are not. So I will take whatever it is that is important for me right here and discard the rest, because these things that I will take from whatever it is that Marinetti said are the things that are important for me here, and that will have a connection with other elements, other artistic elements that I'm dealing with right now. So that is what I mean when I say that we have always to take into account how in a specific place is processed something that comes from another place. Of course, we have this idea, yes, there's a transnational circulation of futurism, for example. But when you see specifically in this place or that place, the way they deal with futurism is different. In the case of Brazil, for instance, what did Mário de Andrade say? Well, I'm not a futurist like Marinetti. What I do is different, although I do have some interfaces with what he does. So that's what I meant. I don't know if it was clear enough. Sorry.
And a quick question. When you describe your models and the writers of the time who were discussing the interaction between the older colonial and the post-colonial literatures, are we talking about a group of people who would be descendants directly from the colonial power, or does it bring in some of the native indigenous culture as well into the literature?
Well, the first thing we would have to discuss is if there is a pure, absolutely pure indigenous person or indigenous author. Because I'll just give you an example. Like 10 years ago, I have many former students of mine who work in the Amazonic region. And one of these students of mine works at Universidade Federal de Roraima. That's very close to the Venezuela border in the northern Brazil. And there you have a very huge, what we call reserva, which is an indigenous area supposedly preserved and where only native American live there. But there's this big street that crosses the reserva. And then I went with this former student of mine, who now is a professor there at the Universidade Federal de Roraima. I went from the capital, Boa Vista, to Venezuela. And then he was almost out of gas. And I was getting nervous because, well, there was nothing there. It was a reserva. So supposedly, there's nothing around except Native Americans. And at some time, when I told him, well, look, if you go like 1 kilometer more, we will be out of gas. And he was very calm, and he turned to a place where there was an oca. Oca is a hut, and he honked, and there came a really Native American to talk to us. Well, he had first he had jeans, of course, Levi's, and he had also what you say those shirts that belong to soccer teams. You say Corinthians, by the way, which is a team from São Paulo, a state in the south. And of course, he had a hat, a cowboy hat, which you know is a Native American part of a garment, no? And then he sold us some gas because that's how he made money. He made money selling gas to the people who, like my former student, were in need in the middle of nowhere. That was the case of the reserva. And so and he spoke a perfect Portuguese, by the way. The question is, if we speak of the present, it is very much difficult, and I'm speaking of an extended present. It's very difficult to find or to even to ask for something that's pure, so as to say. Then what I would say about all those authors is that they represent arguments, positions, they represent ways of seeing things that comes from various positions. And even, just to give you an example of what I was talking about, and a certain something that we should just put in question in a relativistic position. Machado de Assis, that was the last author I have quoted here. Machado de Assis is for some of the representatives of the position of concerning race, considered as a black author. Because I didn't show his photo here. If I showed you, would say, oh, of course he is. But the question is, his death certificate says that he's white. So the question of how are you going to classify authors in, and I can give you a wide range of classifications. In the case of Brazil, at least, is very much complicated because, of course, what I can say for sure is that any idea of classifying by pure standards would be really in a bad position. Many thanks.
What else related to that? I wanted to ask you to develop a bit further that your approach to the idea of lusophonia.
To the idea of?
Lusophonia.
Lusophonia. Okay.
I was just thinking about someone such as Rodrigo Vieira in the case of Angola, how, for example, his Luanda was was essential in the development of progressive creativity in Portugal, but also about how the work of Longino Vieira cannot be understood without the influence of Kimbundu, for example, in Angola. So in that sense, to what extent can we keep that label of Portugalidade or lusofonia to refer to cultural, literary traditions and contemporary manifestations?
Well, I think first we have to think politically. Lusophonia is part of, it's not the only word created to designate a wider spectrum of countries that speak the same language. The Francophonia is the most known, and Anglophonia, as far as I know, they don't need to do this because it's already in another department, so as to say. But I think, specifically in the case of Lusophonia, first of all, differently from Francophonia, there is a very great resistance from the part of especially the former colonies. I'm not including Brazil, I mean Angola, Mozambique, because they say that the word Luso erases a part that's not, that does not belong to Portugal specifically. But speaking of these countries, speaking of the countries that are members of the CPLP, like the Community of Portuguese-speaking countries, there are many interesting things to consider. First of all, Galicia, as you know, is a part of this community of Portuguese-speaking countries. And as far as we know, Galego is not exactly the same language as Portuguese, so there's a political issue related to it, and this political issue concerns the position of Galicia towards the rest of Spain with all the linguistic problems that we know they have there. The second thing is that Portuguese does not have the same situation in every country that officially speaks Portuguese. For instance, in Brazil, everybody speaks Portuguese. I would say that maybe 1% of the population, some Amerindian population in the middle of the jungle, doesn't speak Portuguese as a first language, but the rest of the population does speak Portuguese as a first language. That's not true of Angola, that's not true of Mozambique, that's not true of Cabo Verde. In Cabo Verde you have a real bilingual population, but it's Portuguese is a second language. Now they are developing a grammar of their local language, but it's not the same as in Portugal or as in Brazil. Cabo Verde is a third situation where, yes, Portuguese is generalized as a second language. People speak Portuguese really, but I was last year a member of the jury of the Prêmio Camões. The Camões Prize is the most important prize in the Portuguese language for literature. And the winner was Germando de Almeida, who is an author from Cape Verde, from Cabo Verde. And it's interesting that I met a former diplomat that worked there in Cabo Verde, and he told me that, he knew Germano de Almeida, and he had a personal relationship with Germano de Almeida, but that he, when he went to Cabo Verde, he thought that he could live only with Portuguese. But he discovered there that although, of course, everybody understood him when he spoke Portuguese, in fact, daily life was not in Portuguese. Daily life was in the local language. So he had to learn the local language for those small things of daily life, although administration and things like this would be okay with Portuguese. So what I mean is, even if we're talking about a specific domain of language, this language is not the same. It doesn't mean the same in every space where the language circulates, because people are different, historical relations are different, and from this there are many consequences. That's the general idea. Okay?
I'm going to ask a really basic and silly question, because I'm really interested in this question of how we would write different literary histories. So the kind of literary histories that you've talked to us about from a Brazilian perspective, from a Latin American perspective here, through these different theorists who have presented this quite, what seems to be continuing through. There was this agonistic view, but in effect what we're calling for is this a way of understanding literary histories and literary relations and literary circulations that isn't always rooting us back into the national. And I'm just wondering, there have been various models proposed more recently, the idea of world literature, Pascal Casanova's, the World Republic of Letters and so on. What would be your contribution if you were going, would we just end up with kind of lots of fragmented literary histories ultimately and it's the multiplicity, or can we imagine a way of writing and inclusive and diverse?
I think there's no easy answer for this. And we, the people who work with literature, and even people who, like me, work with comparative literature, although when I was a young man, a comparatist would have to be somebody who was able to deal with at least 3 languages beyond his own. There's this question: 4 languages is not enough. If you think of the multiplicity of languages in which literature expresses itself all around the world, 4 languages is nothing. So this means that even for the old school comparatists like myself, and I'm a very modest one because there are people who speak like 7 or 10 languages, but even 10 languages wouldn't be enough. The question arises of translation, because of course I imagine that Dostoevsky, for instance, if I had to learn Russian to read Dostoevsky, I think it would be maybe in another existence, but in this one it wouldn't happen. And today I think we have to deal with, people who are professionally involved in this field, linguistically and literarily, so as to say. I think we have to deal we have to choose the points towards which we are going to direct our actions. For instance, if we speak about translation, of course, we know that today the question of translations for the authors, from their perspective, it's better for them if especially if they come from a minor, language that's not so widely known, like Czech, like one of the languages of Angola, not Portuguese. For these authors, it's good for them to have the works translated or to write in a language where they could reach a wider audience. And this has been a question for many of these writers, contemporary writers, if they should write in this language, wider language, because many times they are bilingual, or if they should write in their own language, the so-called minority language, because this language needs to be written, and needs to have romances, needs to have novels, needs to have poetry written in itself. But I think from the point of view of the wider audience, it's better for them to be published in this other language, in a language that that will open for them a wider audience. That's the case, for instance, of the African, the Portuguese, in the Portuguese world, of the African writers, the writers from Angola, from Mozambique. They are published in Portugal and Brazil because, and in Portuguese, of course, because, of course they wouldn't be published in Portugal or Brazil if it wasn't in Portuguese. And also this opens for them a public that wouldn't be opened if they were writing in another language. And I guess this is the case, and there are more dramatic cases. There is one very good writer in Timor-Leste. Timor is a very, very small country that was invaded by Indonesia, and that had Portuguese as an official language. Although people don't speak Portuguese in general in this country, Timor, but Portuguese is an official language, and there's a very good writer there who writes in Portuguese. Of course, probably he knows the other language, but he chose to write in Portuguese to be read by a wider audience. I'm just giving examples of the Portuguese language. But of course, this is true also of the African writers who chose to write in French, who are published in Paris normally. Some of them are very much famous. Some of them went or are in the French Academy. For instance, Leopold Senghor, for instance, this Ami Malouf, today, very good writers. And Ami Malouf, speaking of this question, Ami Malouf says, well, people ask me if I'm Lebanese or French, if French is my language or if Arab is my language. And I Ami Malouf, I say, well, I'm not specifically one or the other. I'm both of them. And I guess this is the most interesting answer I've seen coming from an author to this question of how should we deal with different languages, being, in this case of this specific author, a guy who can do both languages. Okay?